There we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Chanel Hasten. I am the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance, and thank you for being here this evening for our U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service panel discussion on sea otter reintroduction along the Pacific West Coast. I will open it up with a little summary about the Elakha Alliance and who we are, then I will pass it off to Lilian Carswell. So happy Sea Otter Awareness Week. This is the 20th anniversary, and the theme is Path to Coexistence, celebrating the progression towards a positive relationship between people and sea otters. This occurs every year during the last full week of September and is organized in partnership with Sea Otter Savvy, Defenders of Wildlife, California State Parks, the Elakha Alliance, and the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And we do have a stakeholder survey because your voice and opinion does matter in terms of reintroduction, which I will put in the chat after I'm done speaking. So be sure to check that out. So the Elakha Alliance, who are we and what are we doing? So we are a nonprofit based in Oregon, working towards the reintroduction of sea otters along the Oregon coast, and in the process helping make Oregon's marine ecosystem more robust and resilient. So that is pretty much in a nutshell what we're trying to do. We were created by the late David Hatch, who was a Select tribal member. And so there are strong cultural ties with sea otters here along the Oregon coast. And we want to reintroduce them to reignite those ties and also help our marine ecosystems and also boost our economy on the coast as well. So our strategic objectives, we published a feasibility study, which I will talk about in a second, on sea otter restoration here in Oregon. And currently we are working on that second goal of reaching regional consensus. And then once that happens, then we will hopefully move forward with restoration here along the Oregon coastline. So, you know, really easily defined in this chart here is once we get the science right and achieve consensus, then we will move forward and hopefully have animals in the water over the next several years. And so we published, as I said, our feasibility study earlier this year in January of 2022, which you can find on our website, elakhaalliance.org. And in that feasibility study, you can see all the amazing chapters we have. We had 6 of the top sea otter scientists in North America work on this. So it's very thorough, very heavy scientist based, but we made short little summaries for people to understand a little more clearly. So you can read that on our website and take a look. And what we're discussing tonight is the results of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Feasibility Assessment on sea otter reintroduction in Northern California and Oregon. So they used our feasibility study to help with their study as well. So because I am in charge of outreach and communications, I'm going to pitch our outreach. So if you don't already follow us on the social media channels, be sure to do that on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. This video will be posted tonight on our YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it as many times as you'd like. And also be sure to sign up for our email newsletter on our website really easily. If you want to stay in tune with what's happening with sea otter reintroduction here in Oregon. So I am pleased to welcome 3 of our amazing panelists tonight. We have Michele Zwartjes. She's a field supervisor for the Oregon Coast Field Office for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Lilian Carswell, who's a Southern Sea Otter Recovery and Marine Conservation Coordinator for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Michele St. Martin, the Marine Conservation Coordinator for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'm going to pass it over to Lilian, who will give a little summary about the feasibility assessment that they recently published on sea otter reintroduction. And then we will open it up for questions. We did ask you, thank you. Many of you submitted questions when you registered for today's webinar, and I have those here. But if you have any more questions that pop up, please use the Q&A feature here on Zoom, and we will get to them as soon as we can. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chanel. Could you please enable screen sharing for me?
Yes. Apologies. There you go. Should be able to do it now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, you're seeing my presentation, right? And not my other stuff?
Yes, we do. Looks great.
Okay, thanks so much. Let me move my menu out of the way here. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. As Chanel said, I'm Lilian Carswell, the Southern Sea Otter Recovery and Marine Conservation Coordinator. I'm based in California, and I'm here with Michele Zwartjes and Michele St. Martin. We were the three people who authored the Sea Otter Reintroduction Assessment. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of what is in our assessment, and then we're going to open it up to questions. Our assessment began with a congressional directive that was in the explanatory language to the 2021 Appropriations Act. And specifically, we were directed to study the feasibility and cost of reestablishing sea otters on the west coast of the lower 48 and to report back on that. So we did indeed do an assessment, and we released the assessment to the public a couple of months ago. Our approach was to frame it as a companion to the Elakha Alliance feasibility study. As Chanel just mentioned, some of the most illustrious sea otter scientists alive participated on that study, so we certainly weren't about to try to duplicate it. So we view this as a companion to that, so keep that in mind. We took a slightly different approach. We followed the IUCN framework, the guidelines for reintroductions and other conservation translocations. And specifically, we asked the two questions that they recommend asking. Is there a conservation benefit to the species and ecosystem? And is reintroduction a viable option? And to answer the question about viability, we need to know whether it's feasible. So we need to evaluate feasibility, and we also need to evaluate risk. And finally, we limited consideration to Oregon and Northern California. So that's not the same as the Pacific coast or the contiguous US, but there are reasons we did not choose to evaluate Washington. And part of the reasons for that are what I'm going to go over right here when I orient you to this map here. So this dark line here, this purple line is occupied range. This is northern sea otter. It's a distinct subspecies from the southern sea otter. This population here is the result of a translocation effort that happened in the early 1970s. This pale line along the coast here represents historical range that's currently unoccupied. So you see that entire portion, all of Oregon and Northern California, and then also down here, all through most of Southern California and Baja California, Mexico. This is the occupied range of the southern sea otter subspecies, mostly limited to the Central California coast with a small translocated population at San Nicolas Island. And let me just call your attention to this fading color scheme where the purple sort of fades into orange here. The reason for that is because we think Oregon was historically a transition zone between the northern sea otter subspecies and the southern sea otter subspecies. Our goals and objectives in reintroduction that we articulate in the feasibility assessment are twofold. The first is to restore the species, meaning the sea otter in its global range, and specifically improve the status of the southern sea otter subspecies. And the elements of that would be to address the largest gap in the historical range. I just showed you where that gap was. To reestablish that historical transition zone, to increase gene flow and genetic diversity, which would be helpful both to the northern sea otter and southern sea otter. All sea otters have very low genetic diversity as a result of past bottlenecks, and especially the bottleneck imposed by the fur trade. But southern sea otters in particular have extremely low genetic diversity, but they also have unique alleles that are adapted to the more southerly portion of the range, and those could be useful to assist northern sea otters in evolving in the face of climate change. And finally, another objective would be to contribute to recovery and delisting of the southern sea otter by increasing the number and range of the subspecies and increasing genetic diversity. The second goal is to restore ecosystem function. And the first would be ecosystem resilience. And you see this picture down here. Those of you who are divers have probably seen this on the West Coast recently, or since the sea star die-off. We've had heat waves and sea star die-offs that have contributed to this dominance of purple urchins, and purple urchins denuding the kelp forest completely, creating what's known as an urchin barrens. Where sea otters are present, they impart ecosystem resilience, so they're complementary to other predators, and in fact, they're considered a keystone predator in kelp forest ecosystems. Through their consumption of sea urchins, they keep healthy kelp forests intact. And that's not to say that they're perfect. So on the Central California coast, where we also had a sea star die-off, but we do have sea otters. We have kind of a mosaic of kelp bed patches and small urchin barrens, but we don't have widespread urchin barrens as have occurred in some of the places that are devoid of sea otters. So with that increase in kelp, and also I should mention in seagrass, you can ask us about that later if you want to know the details of the seagrass and sea otter connection. But the short answer is that sea otters improve kelp abundance and resilience and seagrass abundance and resilience. And in doing so, they're increasing biodiversity because that kelp and seagrass provides homes to hundreds, if not thousands, of other species. Kelp and seagrass sequester carbon. So atmospheric carbon that's contributing to climate change gets absorbed in the ocean, and kelp and seagrass help to sequester that in marine sediments or in the deep sea. And then finally, kelp and seagrass help to impart resilience to the effects of climate change. So this isn't talking about the cause of climate change, which is that excess CO2. This is about the effects, which are shoreline erosion and ocean acidification. Both kelp and seagrass help to mitigate that. And so in turn, sea otters, through their positive effects on kelp and seagrass, are having these beneficial trickle-down effects. So for biological feasibility, we determined that suitable habitat and prey are available. This little asterisk here is just an indicator that we would do specific prey surveys for specific sites, but in general, this is true that habitat and prey are available. We would expect beneficial effects. Those are all the ones I just went over on the last slide. And experience from past reintroductions indicates that translocation or reintroduction by other means is likely feasible. As for socioeconomic feasibility, there are a range of potential impacts, and those include commercial shellfish and recreational shellfish harvest, tribal shellfish harvest. There may be regulatory requirements that increase, such as perhaps for marine construction projects, but that's not necessarily given. So that should be a little nuanced. There could be additional regulatory restrictions on fishing gear. And we're unable currently to authorize incidental take in fisheries under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and that applies to southern sea otters only. And that is in fact the case throughout the existing southern sea otter range. And we do still have, we have a bunch of fisheries in California. There are potential benefits. Those ecosystem services mitigating the effects of climate change. There are expected benefits to commercial and recreational finfish fishing. There are quite substantial benefits to ecotourism and recreational diving. And I should mention that there's a study that came out of British Columbia a couple of years ago that measured all these effects and noted that the economic benefits of sea otter reintroduction outweighed the costs by about 7 times. And a large part of that was ecotourism, which was responsible for 4 times as much as any fishery losses. Then there would be benefits to cultural values and traditional significance. And finally, there's existence value, and that's just the value in knowing that sea otters are out there, even if you never see them or benefit from them any material way. Then there's the question of legal feasibility, and the short answer is that legal authorities are in place to permit reintroductions. The 2 most significant acts that apply to sea otters are the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. And on the West Coast, that would apply to the southern sea otter only. Under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, there's a take moratorium, meaning you cannot kill them, you can't call them, you can't control them by killing them. So some people consider that a liability, but we have ideas for how to deal with socioeconomic impacts that don't involve culling sea otters. And then, as I mentioned, there's no authorization for incidental take of southern sea otters in commercial fisheries. As part of our reintroduction assessment, we conducted a bunch of stakeholder interviews, some in California, some in Oregon. These were certainly not meant to, we make no claims of being comprehensive, but this was a smattering of people that we knew would be interested, and we wanted to know what they had to say. And this is some of the stuff we heard: that we need a clear management plan, that there are potential negative effects on shellfish, that there are cumulative impacts on fisheries, meaning fisheries are being squeezed from all sides. Others noted that ocean resources are a public trust. But then there were also perspectives on the benefits about kelp forest restoration and ecosystem resiliency, for tourism, for existence value, and tribal perspectives were mixed. And that's as a result of, cultural significance of sea otters, but also historical use of sea otters for food and concerns about impacts on fisheries. In conclusion, so these are the conclusions on feasibility. Remember, we were evaluating feasibility and risk, even though it's called a feasibility assessment, it's really a feasibility and risk assessment. So biologically, we conclude it's feasible. We do need additional evaluations of specific potential reintroduction sites, and we do recommend experimental pilot studies. I'll go back into that in a second. Socioeconomically, we think it's feasible. We recognize it could result in both benefits and costs, and that further evaluation is needed to reduce the risk and uncertainty. And legally, it's feasible. There's no legal constraints, but some regulatory changes may be desirable, and that will be up for discussion. As for costs, we were also supposed to determine costs. So this estimate ranges from 25 to 43 million. That would cover 3 years of baseline assessments and 10 years of implementation. Notably, that does not cover the preliminary planning stuff. The conclusions on risk, we note that biologically, there's a risk of inaction, and especially for the southern sea otter, waiting for natural range expansion to occur, which is not occurring because of sharks at both ends of the Central California range. That exposes the southern sea otter to risk from some catastrophic event because of the lack of redundancy in population, and also because of its diminished adaptive capacity due to low genetic diversity. Socioeconomically, we don't know exactly how severe and what the scope is of this risk, and we need additional evaluation to determine whether the risk can be lowered to levels that are acceptable. And we can only do this once we have identified specific reintroduction sites, and we do socioeconomic impact assessments that are targeted onto those sites. And finally, there's low legal risk. There's, as I mentioned, lack of authorization for take southern sea otters in commercial fisheries, limited options for management of sea otters, but infinite options for management of impacts. So in conclusion, is reintroduction a viable conservation option? we determine, yes, it's feasible. Yes, there's significant benefit to species and ecosystem, but work is needed on the socioeconomic front to reduce the uncertainty and risk associated with potential impacts. So the next steps that we recommend in the assessment are to initiate a facilitated, structured decision-making process. This would include stakeholders, scientists, agency members, and also to initiate a big outreach effort to reach stakeholders who may not even know that they're stakeholders in this, to develop criteria for the selection and evaluation of potential reintroduction sites, to conduct a comprehensive socioeconomic impact assessment for those specific sites that are identified as potentially biologically and logistically feasible, and to plan one or more experimental pilot projects. This might be to test the viability of using surrogate reared sea otter pups as a source for new populations. You can ask us about that if you don't know what I'm talking about there. And also potentially to test releases of small numbers of wild captured otters, which have a very high homing tendency, maybe to test releases of those otters into estuary environments, or think of other ways that we might increase retention. And so that is the end of my presentation, and we want to spend the rest of this time on questions from you. So I'm going to stop sharing. Right, Chanel?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, super. Great presentation. Thank you, Lilian. All right, we have a plethora of questions that you all submitted, so thank you so much for doing that. We'll start right off, and if any other questions pop up, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. So I believe you sort of mentioned this in your presentation, but we'll just rehash it out. What about reintroducing sea otters in Washington and British Columbia?
I guess I'll take that. Hi everyone, I'm Michele Zwartjes. I'm the supervisor of the report field office, as Chanel mentioned earlier, and one of the report authors. Well, in fact, about 1/3 of all the sea otters that we have present on the globe today are the result of past reintroductions, and that includes reintroductions that have already occurred in Washington and in British Columbia. So those were a series of reintroductions that took place in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and the sea otters that we currently have in British Columbia and Washington are the product of past reintroductions. The type of translocation that Lilian mentioned, where wild sea otters were captured as adults or subadults and moved to the coastlines of those areas. I think that answers that question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So what do you think is the greatest hurdle or threat to reintroduction?
I'll try that one. That's a big question. I'm not really sure, but I would say that probably it would be misconceptions about the scale and timing of impacts. So I think a lot of people have in their minds that if we embark on reintroduction, there are going to be massive changes in the ecosystem immediately, and that we're going to have a whole bunch of otters, and then it's going to be Southeast Alaska, which some people consider to be a big problem, with lots and lots of otters all over the place and a booming population. There are a lot of differences between the habitat up there and the habitat here. The California population is along a narrow linear band of coastline, and that's pretty much the same. It's similar to what's in Oregon. So it's not this broad, flat, shallow area that sea otters can branch in every direction, and that makes for very fast population growth. So we're certainly not going to have that on the outer coast. We could have fast population growth in an estuary. But the other thing is that reintroductions always start out slowly. It's just inevitable. We're talking about really tiny numbers of animals. And so impacts would be very, very small at the beginning, or really pretty much imperceptible. And that includes benefits. Benefits also would be imperceptible, except for ecotourism, where a few otters can really bring out a crowd right away. But the ecosystem effects are going to be delayed in time and very small. And so I think if people keep that in mind, I think it would reduce resistance. And then I think we could have productive conversations and go forward.
Thank you. So maybe some people are unaware, but why aren't sea otters at these sites already? What happened to them?
You mean initially?
I think so.
Oh,
Go
Well,
for it.
well, sea otters were I'm sorry, Michele, were you gonna? Sea otters were hunted for the fur trade in the 1700s and 1800s, and so they were effectively eliminated from the vast majority of their historical range, which once expanded from the islands of Japan down into Baja, California, Mexico. There were estimates that they were reduced to about 1% of their original population numbers, and those persisted in just 13 small colonies, not even colonies, really groups, initially numbering probably at most 1,000 or so animals. Most of those were up in the far islands of Alaska in Russia, and then there was that one tiny little population that persisted, unbeknownst to many people, in California, where they were about to be extinct for a long time until they were rediscovered in 1980. So today, the sea otters we have are a result of natural recovery, as well as those past reintroductions that I mentioned earlier. But we still have the largest remaining gap in the historical range between the central coast of Washington and the sea otters in California to extend it right now to about half a million.
I'd like to tag on a little bit to Michele's answer there and just follow on the answer that I just gave, which is that along a narrow band of coastline, you have very slow range expansion. So why haven't southern sea otters expanded up to Oregon after all this time, after more than 100 years of protection? And it's because of that slow pace of range expansion. And that's what we would continue to expect, even with the reintroduced population along that outer coast in that configuration of habitat. The other major issue is sharks at the north and south ends of the southern sea otter range, preventing them from expanding their range in that direction. And then the Washington population is obviously up in Washington, and it has, it is expanding fairly quickly towards the south, but it has just ramped up fairly recently, but it also would not be expected to reach Oregon waters anytime soon.
Thank you. Let's see here. So many great questions. So there's a lot of questions about when. When would possible reintroduction take place? And is there a goal or a commitment date?
Well, for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I know everyone wants to know when's it going to start, but I'll say that we just finished our feasibility assessment, and what was the second part of the question? Is there a goal date or a?
Yeah, is there a goal date?
Okay, so no, there is not. What the Fish and Wildlife Service is committed to following the process that we laid out in our study, and the last chapter there, if you take a look at it, is next steps. And those next steps lay out the continued information gathering that we would need to complete to even come close to the point of making an actual proposal to reintroduce. So there's no proposal to reintroduce at this time. And as Lilian mentioned in her introduction, our feasibility assessment, even though it's called that, is actually kind of a two-part feasibility assessment, and then there's a risk assessment that goes along with that. And even though we concluded that the reintroduction of sea otters is feasible, we consider that part of the assessment pretty robust and more or less complete. The risk assessment is where we concluded we need more information in order to move forward. So we need to be able to more accurately predict projected impacts of a reintroduction from both an ecological and an economic point of view, and we need to get stakeholders involved in that process. And so that's part of that structured decision-making process that Lilian laid out, that we need to get scientists, we need to get stakeholders, we need to get agency reps all involved in identifying the criteria that we use for identifying specific reintroduction sites and being able to do more specific studies in those areas in order to know whether we can reduce risk to acceptable levels to be able to move forward.
But as far as timing, so we've had this conversation internally. We're like, how long would this take if we really did it? And we do think that the very earliest, just to give you guys an idea, no promises, but the very earliest would be 3 to 4 years and probably longer. But certainly not tomorrow is the main point. But not, you know, a decade. In between tomorrow and a decade.
That's a good answer, yeah. But I mean, there are a number of steps that would need to happen, you know. So there's additional information gathering. Say we were to get to the point where we're actually going to propose, okay, we think we want to go ahead and reintroduce the otter. We would have to go through the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act. We would have to put a proposal out there, people would public comment on it. There's still all the permitting that would be required. You know, even if Fish and Wildlife Service were to propose carrying out the reintroduction, we would still have to permit ourselves. And I don't know that we get any special favors or get permits any faster than anyone else does. And if they've gone through that process, it can take a long time.
There's a lot of people who ask this question. What are there specific reintroduction sites already determined? And where are they?
I'll take a stab at that. So we don't have a secret list that we're holding back from all of you. But one of the very earliest steps in proceeding with this would be to identify what sites we're actually talking about. So we do not have that list. To be able to make that list, we need to have a discussion with scientists and talk about potential strategy if there's going to be a reintroduction in California and one in Oregon. What would be the optimal configuration? We need to think about what's good about sites and what's bad about sites. So there's a big payoff if you say, for instance, you reintroduce sea otters into a large estuary. There could be a big payoff in terms of population growth, but there could also be a lot of impacts in that estuary. So it's a balancing act. Or if you chose a smaller estuary that was extremely well protected, then you would be less worried about the anthropogenic risks to those animals, but you would also perhaps have a smaller payoff in the end. So those decisions have yet to be made, but scientists are going forward. They're doing surveys of prey in different potential areas. We are looking a lot at estuaries because of the shark risk, because estuaries have shallow waters and don't have a lot of white sharks in them, if any. There is the risk of 7-gill sharks, but that's an unknown quantity at the moment. So anyway, there are a lot of factors that go into determining the biological ranking that we would have for these sites. They have to be logistically accessible also, because people with boats need to be able to get in there to release the otters, to track the otters, etc. And then once we have a sort of biological priorities, then we have to subject that to very rigorous socioeconomic evaluation and look at where the socioeconomic impacts are. And then we'll rearrange those priorities entirely, perhaps. So it's a long process of saying where those sites are going to be. So no, we don't have the list yet. But we're taking, if you want to propose, so we just got a letter from the mayor of Emeryville saying he wanted us to consider Emeryville as a potential reintroduction site. So, and we're starting to hear interest from others. And so if you would like to place a bid for your particular area, just send your letters in and we'll consider your sites. And if you really don't want them in a particular site, I'm sure we'll hear from you too.
Yes, all sides. Let's see. Let's see, what otters would be eligible for relocation? Age, sex, origin? Is there a certain otter you're looking for?
All right, I think I'll take a stab at this one. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's, you know, again, something that we would bring in experts to discuss further, because it depends. Each otter is different, whether that's the sex or the age, and for distribution and dispersal patterns. And so I guess the short answer is we don't know, and that would be something that we'd be looking into.
And then I think just to add on to that a bit, as we mentioned earlier, you know, there are a couple potential different scenarios. It could be the translocation of wild caught otters, and there would be different considerations that would go into that in terms of age and sex that you would want, but it could potentially be surrogate reared stranded pups too that are being raised in aquariums, such as the Monterey Bay Aquarium, that could be considered as well. So, or it could be a combination of those two.
Great, thank you. Can someone talk about how any habitat restoration that has to take place before sea otters can be reintroduced into an area? I'm assuming like from urchin barrens. Does there need to be kelp reforestation and that sort of thing?
That is such a great question. So in the North Coast Kelp Forest Plan, I noticed that they actually don't consider the possibility of sea otter reintroduction as one of the things that they could do right now to help restore the kelp, because their assumption is there's no kelp forest, therefore sea otters can't live there. Or, you know, the urchins are starving, so sea otters will have no food, and so they can't be there. That is actually not the case. Sea otters eat so many different types of prey that they can function very well in a sea urchin barren. They're just eating other stuff. They're not necessarily eating the starving urchins right there in the center of the barren. But if there's any little patch of kelp that has regrown, and sometimes that happens, they will defend that patch of kelp by eating the healthy sea urchins that are getting lots of kelp and getting fat gonads right there at the boundary. And they help to preserve those patches and then expand them. So they can definitely live in an area without kelp. Of course, they do like kelp. The females especially benefit from kelp because they can help anchor their pups and keep them from blowing or washing away in heavy surf. So the answer to the question is that type of restoration doesn't necessarily need to be done before otters get back. Sea otters will restore it themselves. But then there are other cases where restoration would probably have to be done. And that would perhaps be heavily industrialized areas or polluted areas. I mean, it's kind of difficult to imagine dredging out polluted sediments, so I don't really know how feasible it would be to, you know, make a toxic place non-toxic to sea otters. That would probably be somewhat difficult. But the other type of restoration is kind of like a more restoration light, and that would be adjusting the human activities that are occurring in that particular area, potentially. But honestly, the very likely thing is that we would pick a site that already looks good for sea otters. And then the other thing that honestly would happen is that sea otters will go wherever the heck they want, because that is what they do. You can pick the perfect place for sea otters and put them there, and they will probably go somewhere else. And so they will play a role in showing us what are appropriate areas for sea otters.
I'm really glad you pointed that out, Lilian. I think that's really very important for people to understand that, you know, we can pick, but, you know, get everyone in the room and say, okay, here's the perfect site. This is where we want the sea otters to stay. And they may not pay any attention to our rule set at all. So we do need to be prepared for that eventuality.
Great. All right, another question. Do we sidestep some of the ESA and MMPA permitting processes if we reintroduce surrogate/sanctuary otters?
No,
All the same rules, regulations, permits apply.
Great. Let's see, is there a minimum number of otters needed to relocate in order to repopulate an area?
I'll start.
I saw you on mute, Lilian.
I'm
so I was
sorry.
like-
There probably is. Past reintroductions have shown that there's sort of a minimum number of otters below which you have a chance of petering out. I mean, you have a chance of petering out at any size really, but there's sort of like a critical threshold. And so it's not really the number of animals you move, it's the number of animals that end up staying that is really, that's what matters. But we have seen in past reintroductions or past translocations that, about 90% have left. And so if you're using wild sea otters, you're going to have to expect high attrition. And you might have to move quite a few to get that core population that sticks and then starts growing. But with this idea of surrogate reared sea otters, we could be consistently adding, 3 to 5 otters to the population every year. We could just be dropping them off in there and supplementing. And who knows, we haven't done translocation, we haven't done reintroductions like that in the past. Like the past translocations, some of them were multi-year where they dropped off a bunch of animals, and then they just stopped and let it go. What if we did a small number of animals just repeatedly for 10 years? We don't know. That might work better. We're not sure. And now, Michele, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I guess the only thing I was thinking is looking back at some of the examples where we've gotten down to somewhere between like 10 and 20 animals. At that point, there seems to be kind of a 50-50 chance, it could go either way. Because we got down to about that number in both Oregon and Washington, and the Washington population persisted, but the Oregon population did not. And San Nicolas Island, for a long time, people wrote that off and thought that they were going to disappear. But they maintained that very low number of animals for a long time, and then eventually started growing them. So there seems to be some number at which it can go either way.
And I will pitch our Orso model that Tim Tinker created, the lead author of the Elakha Alliance feasibility study, where you can go to our website and actually input a location along the Oregon coast and a number of female otters and a number of male sea otters, and kind of look at the prediction of success in that area dependent on the population that you put in. So it's kind of neat over time, and you can be the scientist behind the scenes on your computer and test that out. Okay, we have a question here. Could Alaska Sea Life Center do a surrogacy for the northern sea otter pups that they rescue? These otters end up in zoos and aquariums and could be part of otters moved to Oregon or California, since they don't have a strong homing instinct yet.
I'm going to point to Michele St. Martin. Do you know the answer to that?
I don't know if they're set up for that. But yeah, I don't know how realistic that would be, I guess. I don't actually know. Do either
They would
of you?
have to have, they have to have the females available to act as surrogate mothers. And yeah, I'm just not familiar enough with their facilities to know, like Michele said, whether they're set up that way, or if they have those females available.
Okay. Lilian, I know you talked a little bit about eelgrass in the beginning of your presentation. Can you speak about the importance of estuaries as possible reintroduction sites?
Well, I'm not sure if this question is about the ecological, so I'll answer both. Okay, so its importance as a reintroduction site for sea otters is what I mentioned before. There are a lot of white sharks on the outer coast biting sea otters, and that's preventing range expansion. So to put sea otters in an estuary is a good idea for that reason. Sea otters also appear to have a range of interesting beneficial effects on seagrass, but it seems to differ from place to place. And so we haven't figured, there's no generalized, unlike with the urchins where it's fairly standard, you know, you put sea otters near an urchin barrens and eventually that urchin barrens is probably going to go away or at least become a mosaic. Not all the time, not in every single case, but I mean, it's a pretty generalized paradigm. The seagrass thing is pretty recent. Brent Hughes was the scientist who first discovered this. He discovered it in Elkhorn Slough, and the way it works there, Elkhorn Slough is in a little town called Moss Landing on the Central California coast, just north of Monterey. So in Elkhorn Slough, sea otters eat a bunch of crabs, and the crabs then no longer are eating all the sea hares and other stuff. And the sea hares can then get bigger and their population can become more abundant. And then they become very effective at cleaning seagrass. And why does seagrass need to be cleaned, you ask? Seagrass gets fouled by these little epiphytic algae things. It looks like this brown, fuzzy, gross coat, this coating on the seagrass. And that's made worse by pollution, like, you know, nitrogen runoff and stuff from farms, which can cause these epiphytic algal things to bloom. So the seagrass gets snuffed out by those algae coats. So it needs to be cleaned off regularly by these sea hares, and they go up and down, grazing the stuff off and keeping the seagrass all nice and bright and clean and green. So that's how sea otters do it in Elkhorn Slough, just by eating the crabs. It initiates this whole thing. And then they rest in the seagrass. So they're like, oh, I've made my bed, now I'll lie in it. In other areas, such as in BC, they are increasing the genetic diversity of seagrass by digging for infaunal prey. So they dig for these clams and stuff. They're causing this disturbance. The disturbance causes the seagrass to flower, and that's sexual reproduction as opposed to asexual reproduction, which is just cloning. And so by causing the seagrass to flower, it increases the genetic diversity of the seagrass, and that makes the seagrass more resilient. So that's super cool and interesting, but different from what's happening in California. And then, you know, there was another study that just looked sort of range wide through Alaska and at sea otter effects. And it seems that sea otters they're positively correlated with seagrass abundance, but they couldn't figure out what the mechanism was. So stay tuned. There are all kinds of cool and interesting discoveries of sea otter effects on seagrass.
Yes, it's really fantastic. Okay, where would the funding come from to carry out a reintroduction and then additional management actions, etc.?
I presume the funding would come from the federal government, as it has in all of the other reintroduction programs that we've carried out, as for California condors, black-footed ferrets, whooping cranes, any number of species that you like to consider where we have used reintroduction as a recovery tool for various species.
I'll add that I think businesses and nonprofits and others can play a vital role in advancing reintroduction by funding the studies that need to occur. In their Defenders is funding a facilitator for sea otter reintroduction planning in California. So there are certainly things that other agencies can do that will contribute to the effort. And so, you know, when it comes time to putting together an environmental impact statement, to have the studies done already that we can cite, I mean, that is massively important. And so that's a really important thing that other groups can be doing right now.
Excellent point.
Great. What predation pressures, I know we talked about white sharks, do you anticipate in for reintroduced otters to encounter?
I guess I'll talk a little bit about the project that we've been helping with OSU, trying to figure that exactly out. I guess the short answer is we don't know specifically for sharks in Oregon. And so that was a pilot project that we are working with Taylor Chappell with. And so he and some of his students have been tagging 7-gill sharks and hopefully white sharks as well, putting up acoustic buoys to start looking at spatial use patterns along the coast in Oregon to see if there are hot spots or maybe there are seasonal patterns or something like that, so that we can have a better understanding and be able to answer that question.
Yes, and I want to add that the Elakha Alliance is also help funding this research as well. Let's see. Is it reintroduction smart considering current global warming and the current health of our oceans?
I guess I'll just say that we actually think that reintroduction of sea otters is one of the most important things that we can do for the species because of the effects of climate change. Right now, for the southern sea otter, for example, they are restricted in the range for Central California. So if we could expand their range to the more places that they occur, the greater the probability that they will be able to persist somewhere within that range. So a greater range gives them greater resilience to climate change. They also would then have the ability to interact hopefully between the southern and the northern sea otters and increase their genetic diversity, which would increase their adaptive capacity and capability to respond to change over time. Some of the alleles that the southern sea otter has, where they live in a warmer environment already compared to northern sea otters, those alleles might be beneficial for northern sea otters. So there's a number of ways that the sea otters could benefit from reintroduction and reintegration of the two subspecies between southern and northern. Then coming at it from another angle, they could also provide some benefits. Lilian talked about some of the benefits that they can provide in terms of reducing ocean acidification on a local level, reducing the impacts of shoreline erosion from climate change. Again, these things would take a very long time to be realized and would be very small, but it's still an impact that sea otters would have on reducing the impacts of climate change. But the biggest impact that they have would be increasing the biomass of like seagrass beds, which are highly efficient at carbon capture and storing the carbon in the tissues that it's buried in the deep sediments. Kelp, there's a little bit of debate over, we know that kelp is highly efficient carbon capture. There's some debate over whether that carbon is stored in the long term or not. And there's a great amount of research that's going into that right now. But, even though the impacts of sea otters are relatively limited on a global scale, on a local scale, proportionally, they can have a very good effect on carbon capture.
I just want to be time aware. We have about less than 5 minutes left for our webinar. So if you have any burning questions that we haven't answered, please type them into the Q&A. Here's another question for you all. How can we work with stakeholders who are concerned about their livelihoods to either ally their concerns or arrive at compromises? And adding on to that, have you experienced any collaborative efforts between commercial and environmental stakeholders?
I'll take a stab at that. And it's a really important question. It's one of the foremost questions that I think we've tried to address in our study, because I know for me personally, I feel like this is the single most important thing that we can do is to get stakeholders involved in these discussions and to make sure everyone's at the table and has a part in helping us to talk with scientists, to talk with people from coastal communities, to talk with people who could potentially be directly affected by sea otter reintroduction. They're going to have great local knowledge. We want to make sure that we incorporate that into all of our considerations and decision-making processes. So, we've laid out a process to find and bring those folks in from the very beginning to help us, identify the criteria. As we talked about earlier, potentially identifying reintroduction sites is going to be not only based on habitat suitability and prey availability, but where do we think we have the greatest ecological success with the reintroduction, but then you need to layer on these other filters. Where would we have the greatest positive impact in terms of ecotourism dollars, in terms of positive ecosystem services that could be experienced by the communities? How could we maximize all of those positives and minimize any negatives that might be in the equation to make sure that everyone is included in this benefit sharing process?
I'll jump on to that. One thing that we're looking at, and it needs to be fleshed out a lot, and we'd want to have stakeholder input on this, particularly from the people who might be affected negatively by a reintroduction. So shellfish fishermen in particular. We're looking at potential ways of taking some of those benefits and transforming them to offset the any negative effects that might happen to particular industries. And so we have a few ideas that we throw out in our assessment. And one of those is the sea otter stamp, kind of loosely modeled on a duck stamp, where people could, instead of carbon credits, which we've considered and might continue to consider, and instead of, trying to transform those finfish benefits, to take some of those finfish benefits and give them to the shellfish people, we're thinking it might be easiest to do this sea otter stamp thing, and people could buy into this fund. People could buy stamps just for as gifts for others at some reasonable price. Businesses could require municipalities could require businesses that would stand to benefit from ecotourism in an area where sea otters were reintroduced. So like gas stations, restaurants, hotels along a particular area could require them to buy the sea otter stamp as part of their business license at a much larger amount. Corporations or charitable groups could pay into this fund, and the fund would be used to compensate people who suffered losses. And the whole way that would work would need to be figured out. It wouldn't be housed in the federal government. It would be some third-party entity that everyone could trust. All the rules for how you would determine impact and who would receive benefits and when and for how long, all of that would need to be worked out with stakeholders, including the people affected positively and negatively and others. But that's just one idea that we have, where instead of managing otters, which we've tried to do in the past and is quite tragically unsuccessful in some ways and illegal in others, we're thinking, why not manage the impacts? I mean, we have the ability to do that. So let's figure out some creative solutions to do it that way.
And I think the key thing there is that, as you mentioned, those stakeholders would have to be involved. It can't be a system that we come up with and then we say, here's what we're going to do for you. They need to be a part of creating this system.
Super. I think the last kind of question statement is how can stakeholders, individual or from other nonprofits or government, get engaged now if they're interested in making this a reality in our future?
I guess the most straightforward way to answer that is just if you check our website with our feasibility assessment. That's where we're going to be posting the next steps that we'll be taking in public meetings or opportunities to become part of a stakeholder group. For the Fish and Wildlife Service anyway, that is the best way to become engaged in the process. And I know it's very different for the Elakha Alliance, but for us, yeah, having that public input and engagement is going to be quite important. And I don't know if Michele or Lilian, if you have anything to add to that.
I'll say that Sea Otter Savvy, that's a group based in California, has a survey where they ask people's thoughts about reintroduction, and it's kind of an extensive survey, and you have the ability to give narrative responses if you want. You don't have to, but they showed me the first round of results from that, and I thought it was really extremely interesting. And especially the narrative responses, you know, they take some time to read, but they're very interesting. So if you would like to weigh in that way, just visit seaottersavvy.org and find their stakeholder survey.
I put that link in the chat in the beginning, so you should have quick access to that. And also I'll send out this recording to everyone who registered. So I'll put those links in there as well. And for the Elakha Alliance, you can become a monthly donor. That is super beneficial for us. And I can send that link as well, and sign up for our newsletter. So you're always up to date with what we're doing and where we're going and tabling and venturing off to next. And tomorrow, actually, you can meet and greet the Michelles and I at the Oregon Zoo from 11 to 3. And we'll also be at the Oregon Coast Aquarium in Newport for celebration of Sea Otter Awareness Week. So with that, we are a couple minutes over time. So thank you, Lilian, Michele, and Michele for spending your evening with us and answering lots and lots of questions. And thank you, participants, for asking those questions. They're very important. And this is obviously not the end of this conversation. So stay tuned, and we will continue these conversations over the next several years. So with that, yes, thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
tuning in.
Mhm.